Some men run to the mountains when life breaks them in two. Others find what they never knew they were looking for. Elias Boone had been hiding in the Bitterroot Mountains for 20 years, carrying wounds from a war that took his son and his faith. On a foggy morning, he stumbled across something impossible, a massive oak tree with a wooden door built right into its trunk. The door was old and warm, like it was alive. When he opened it, he found a place that shouldn't exist, filled with memories and voices from the past. Inside, he saw his lost son and glimpsed the forgiveness he thought was gone forever. What kind of magic waits in the deep woods for a man who's given up on everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin stood like a weathered prayer against the slope of Widow's Peak, its chinked logs grey with age and mountain weather. 20 winters had carved deep lines around Elias Boone's eyes, the same way wind and snow had carved the valleys below. He sat on his porch in the pre-dawn darkness, watching stars fade into morning light, a tin cup of chicory coffee warming his calloused hands. At 58, Elias carried himself with the careful economy of a man who'd learned that survival meant wasting nothing, not movement, not words, not hope. His beard had gone silver years ago, but his shoulders still held the breadth of the soldier he'd been, the preacher he'd abandoned. The mountains had made him lean and hard, stripping away everything soft until only the essential remained. Inside the cabin, shadows clung to corners that hadn't seen a woman's touch since Sarah died. Her quilted coverlet still lay folded at the foot of the bed, untouched, a museum piece in a house that had become a tomb. On the mantel above the cold fireplace sat a tarnished Civil War medal, its bronze surface catching what little light filtered through the single window. The medal bore the inscription, "For Valor," though Elias had long since forgotten what valor felt like. He'd earned that medal at Shiloh, pulling wounded men from Confederate lines while grape shots screamed overhead. The same hands that now trapped beaver and skinned deer had once lifted broken soldiers to safety, had baptized converts in creek water, had held his dying son while fever burned away everything good in the world. Jacob. The boy's name still caught in his throat like smoke from green wood. 18 years old when the consumption took him, too young to understand why his father could save strangers but couldn't save him. Too young to forgive the man who'd turned away from God's calling because God had turned away from his prayers. Elias rose from his chair, joints protesting the mountain cold. His morning routine never varied: check the snares, tend the small garden behind the cabin, split wood for the stove. Routine kept the ghosts at bay, kept his mind from wandering down paths that led nowhere but deeper into the wilderness of his own making. The snares yielded 2 rabbits, fat from summer feeding. He field-dressed them with practiced efficiency, his knife finding the right cuts without conscious thought. Blood on his hands felt normal now, natural as the sunrise, painting the peaks rose and gold. He'd forgotten what it felt like to heal instead of kill, to offer communion wine instead of spill blood on forest floor. Back at the cabin, he prepared breakfast with the same methodical care he brought to everything. Salt pork in the iron skillet, cornbread from his dwindling supply of meal, strong coffee that could wake the dead if the dead wanted waking. He ate slowly, tasting nothing, watching light creep across the valley floor like forgiveness he'd never receive. His Bible lay on the table beside his plate, leather binding cracked and faded. He hadn't opened it in 7 years, not since the morning he'd thrown it across the room in rage and watched it slam against the wall. The pages had scattered like autumn leaves, verses about God's love and mercy spilling across floorboards that had already heard too many unanswered prayers. He'd gathered the pages carefully, bound them back together with leather cord, but never again tried to find comfort in words that had failed him when he needed them most. Outside, a red-tailed hawk circled high above the timberline, riding thermals with an ease that Elias envied. Freedom looked simple from a distance: just spread your wings and trust the wind. But hawks didn't carry guilt like stones in their chests, didn't wake each morning to the weight of lives they'd failed to save. The war had ended 33 years ago, but some battles never stopped. In his dreams, he still heard the screams at Antietam, still saw boys bleeding out in hospital tents while he read them, scripture they were too young to need. He'd believed then that God worked through his hands, that his calling as both soldier and preacher made him an instrument of divine will. How arrogant that seemed now, how foolishly certain he'd been that righteousness and bullets could exist in the same heart. After breakfast, he checked his provisions, flour running low, salt almost gone, winter coming whether he was ready or not. The nearest settlement lay 2 days' ride through treacherous passes, a journey he made twice yearly for supplies and nothing more. The storekeep there knew him as the hermit from Widow's Peak, a man who paid in gold coins and spoke only when spoken to. Better that way. Words led to questions, and questions led to explanations he couldn't give. He spent the afternoon mending his winter coat, needle and thread, moving with the patience that mountains had taught him. Every stitch had to hold up here. Poor workmanship could mean death when the snows came heavy and deep. Sarah had taught him to sew during their first winter of marriage, her small hands guiding his clumsy fingers until he learned the rhythm of it. She'd laughed at his early attempts, called his stitches manly but mighty uneven. God, how he missed her laughter. Evening came early in the mountains, shadows pooling in valleys like dark water. Elias lit his single kerosene lamp and settled into his chair with a book of Emerson's essays, reading by the golden light that pushed back the gathering dark. Self-reliance had always spoken to him, though he suspected Emerson never meant it as a prescription for 20 years of self-imposed exile. "Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind," he read aloud, his voice rusty from disuse. The words echoed in the cabin's silence, sounding more like accusation than comfort. What integrity remained in a mind that had chosen solitude over service, safety over love? The wind picked up outside, singing through the pines with a voice that sounded almost human. On nights like this, when loneliness sat heavy as winter snow, he sometimes imagined he heard Sarah calling his name from the darkness beyond his door. Sometimes Jacob's voice, high and sweet as it had been before, the fever changed everything. He never answered those phantom calls, though part of him ached to open the door and follow them into whatever waited in the dark. He closed the book and prepared for bed, banking the fire until only coals remained. His prayers, when they came at all, were brief and bitter things, requests for dreamless sleep, for dawn without memories, for the strength to face another day of beautiful, terrible solitude. God either wasn't listening or had better things to do than tend to broken men who'd lost the right to ask for anything. The bed felt too large, too empty, sheets cold against skin that remembered warmth. Outside, an owl called across the valley, a lonely sound that matched the ache in his chest. Tomorrow would bring the same routine snares. Garden, wood, silence. The mountains would hold him like they had for 20 years, patient as stone, indifferent as winter. But tonight, something felt different in the air, a tension like the moment before lightning strikes. Elias lay still, listening to the wind whisper secrets through the trees, feeling the weight of the medal on the mantle like it was still pinned to his chest. Somewhere in the darkness beyond his cabin, the forest held its breath, waiting for something to change. He pulled Sarah's quilt up to his chin and closed his eyes, unaware that tomorrow would bring the first crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. Unaware that some doors are meant to be opened, especially when we think we're not ready for what lies beyond them. The mist hung thick as wool between the trees, turning the forest into a cathedral of grey shadows and muffled sound. Elias moved through it like a ghost himself, his worn boots finding purchase on familiar paths that 20 years of hunting had carved into his memory. The Winchester in his hands felt light as a reed, though he knew it carried death with the same certainty that morning carried dew. He'd risen before dawn, restless from dreams that lingered like fever. Sarah's voice calling from somewhere beyond reach, Jacob's laughter echoing through rooms that existed only in sleep. The cabin had felt smaller than usual, walls pressing close as coffin boards, so he'd taken his rifle and headed into the woods, where silence made more sense than the ghosts that haunted his dreams. 2 hours into his hunt, the mist began lifting like theater curtains, revealing a landscape transformed by autumn's touch. Maples blazed crimson and gold, their leaves catching what little sunlight filtered through the canopy. The air tasted of wood smoke and dying summer, crisp with the promise of snow that would come within the month. Elias paused beside a lightning-struck pine, listening to the forest breathe around him, the whisper of wind through branches, the distant drumming of a woodpecker, the soft rustle of some small creature moving through fallen leaves. It was then he noticed the wrongness. Not danger, his soldier's instincts would have caught that like a scent on the wind. This was something else, something that made the hair on his neck stand and his breathing shallow. The forest had gone too quiet, as if every living thing held its breath in anticipation. Even the wind seemed to pause, leaving the mist hanging motionless between the trees like smoke from cold fires. Elias turned east, following a game trail he'd walked 1,000 times, when the path seemed to bend where no bend should be. The mist played tricks with distance, made familiar landmarks disappear behind walls of grey, but he knew these woods better than his own reflection. The trail shouldn't curve here, shouldn't lead upward toward the rocky spine of Black Elk Ridge, where nothing but stone and stubborn pine could find purchase. Yet there it was, clear as scripture, winding upward through trees that seemed older than the mountains themselves. Ancient oaks with trunks thick as houses, their bark scarred by decades of storms and seasons. Elias had never seen oaks grow at this elevation, never found this particular grove in all his years of wandering these slopes. But the path beckoned with the certainty of water running downhill, and something deeper than curiosity pulled him forward. The mist thickened as he climbed, until he moved through a world reduced to arm's-length visibility. His boots found solid ground with each step, but the forest around him felt dreamlike, insubstantial. The rifle in his hands grew heavy as doubt, though he couldn't say why fear crept up his spine like cold fingers. Then the mist parted, and he saw it. The oak stood alone in a clearing that hadn't existed moments before, its massive trunk twisted and split, as if lightning had tried to cleave it in half, but failed. The tree reached toward, heaven with branches thick as a man's waist, its canopy lost in the grey above. But it was the base of the trunk that stopped Elias cold, made his breath catch in his throat like a prayer he'd forgotten how to say. There, set into the living wood as naturally as bark itself, hung a door. Not built against the tree or carved from its flesh, but grown into it, as if the oak had dreamed of human habitation and made the dream real. The door was old, older than old, its wood weathered to silver grey and worn smooth by countless years of mountain weather. Iron hinges, black with age, held it in place against a frame that seemed to pulse with life. And from the gap beneath the door came warmth, honest-to-God warmth that had no business existing in a hollow tree on a cold mountain morning. Elias stood frozen, rifle half raised, every instinct screaming contradictions. His mind catalogued impossible details, the way morning light seemed to gather around the door like moths to flame, how the air itself shimmered with heat waves that rose from somewhere deep within the tree's heart. The brass doorknob, green with verdigris, caught the light and threw it back in patterns that hurt to follow. He took a step closer, then another, until he stood close enough to touch the bark. The tree's surface felt warm beneath his palm, not just sun-warmed but alive warm, like skin over a beating heart. The wood grain seemed to shift and flow beneath his fingers, and he jerked his hand back, as if burned. At his feet, something glinted in the fallen leaves. He knelt and brushed away the oak's droppings, until he found it an acorn unlike any he'd seen before. Where normal acorns wore brown caps and held the promise of future trees, this one glowed with soft inner light, warm as a coal, fresh from the fire. He picked it up with trembling fingers and felt it pulse against his palm like a tiny heart, steady and sure. The wrongness of it all should have sent him running. 20 years in, these mountains had taught him to trust his instincts, to know when the forest held dangers beyond his understanding. Bears could be avoided, wolves respected, weather endured. But this defied every law of nature he understood, challenged the very foundations of a world where trees didn't grow doors and acorns didn't carry their own light. Yet beneath the fear, something else stirred. A hunger he'd thought dead, a curiosity that 20 years of isolation hadn't quite managed to kill. The door called to him without words, promised answers to questions he'd stopped asking long ago. What lay beyond that threshold? What warmth could grow in the heart of living wood? What light could shine in places where light had no business being? He reached for the doorknob, then pulled his hand back. Reached again, hesitated. The brass felt warm beneath his palm, worn smooth by hands he couldn't imagine, couldn't begin to guess at. The metal seemed to recognize his touch, grew warmer still, as if welcoming him home after a long journey. The door swung open without sound, revealing not the hollow interior of a dead tree, but something else entirely. Light spilled out, not the harsh glare of noon sun, but the golden warmth of firelight, of evening lamps in windows, of candles lit against the dark. Beyond the threshold lay a space that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist, yet did with the quiet certainty of breath and heartbeat. Elias stood at the edge of impossible, one foot in the familiar world of mountain and mist, the other poised to step into something that defied every law he'd ever trusted. The warmth that flowed from within carried scents that made his chest tighten with recognition. Wood polish and leather binding, coffee beans and fresh bread, the faint lavender of Sarah's soap. Fear warred with longing in his heart. Reason battled against a hope he'd thought buried with his son. The glowing acorn pulsed in his palm like a signal, like permission, like an invitation written in a language older than words. He stepped back from the door, chest heaving as if he'd run for miles. His hands shook as he closed it, the brass knob cool again beneath his fingers. The warmth faded, the light dimmed, and the clearing became nothing more than forest floor and fallen leaves. But the acorn still glowed in his palm, proof that he hadn't dreamed what he'd seen, evidence that somewhere in the heart of an ancient oak, impossible things waited for men brave enough or broken enough to open doors that shouldn't exist. Elias turned and ran, crashing through the mist like a spooked deer, the glowing acorn clutched tight in his fist, and questions burning in his mind like stars in a moonless sky. Sleep eluded Elias that night like smoke through fingers. He lay on his back, staring at ceiling boards he'd cut and fitted himself, while the glowing acorn pulsed softly on his nightstand like a captured star. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the door in the oak tree, felt the warmth that had no earthly business flowing from dead wood. He tried to convince himself it was a dream brought on by too much solitude, too many years of talking only to the wind. Mountain men went strange. Sometimes he'd heard tales of trappers who claimed to speak with spirits, miners who swore they'd found cities of gold beneath the earth. Isolation played tricks on the mind, made a man see things that weren't there, hear voices in the wind that spoke no words. But the acorn wouldn't let him doubt. It sat beside his lamp, like evidence of a crime he couldn't confess, casting gentle light across the rough-hewn walls of his cabin. When he touched it, warmth spread through his palm and up his arm, carried with it scents and sensations that belonged to memories buried deeper than graves. Dawn came grey and grudging, filtered through clouds that promised early snow. Elias rose from his sleepless bed and went through his morning routine: coffee, cornbread, the careful ritual of preparing for another day of solitude. But his hands shook as he loaded his pack, and his eyes kept drifting to the acorn that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. By full light, he stood again at the edge of the clearing where impossible things grew from living wood. The oak tree loomed before him, massive and patient as a cathedral, its door closed tight, as lips keeping secrets. In daylight, the magic felt less urgent, but no less real. The door existed, solid as stone, warm as flesh, waiting for him to find the courage that had abandoned him the day before. This time, he'd come prepared. Rope coiled on his shoulder in case he needed to climb back to the world he understood. Lantern, oil, and matches in case the light beyond the door proved false. Water and hardtack in case hunger found him in whatever space existed within the tree's heart. He felt foolish, carrying supplies to explore the inside of an oak, but 20 years of mountain living had taught him that preparation meant survival, and survival meant coming home. The door opened at his touch, brass knob warm as a handshake from an old friend. Light spilled out again, that same golden warmth that spoke of hearth fires and evening lamps, of places where people gathered to share stories and break bread together. Elias took a deep breath of mountain air, tasting pine and snow and the bitter memory of smoke, then stepped across the threshold into impossible. The space beyond the door defied every law of nature he'd ever learned. Where the tree's exterior measured perhaps 8 feet across, the interior opened into a room that might have graced a fine house in Denver or San Francisco. Wooden floors, polished to a honey glow, stretched beneath his boots. Windows that couldn't exist looked out on vistas that weren't there, rolling green hills dotted with wildflowers, a stream that caught sunlight like scattered diamonds, mountains that wore different shapes than the peaks he knew. But it was the furniture that stopped his breath in his throat. There, beside a fireplace that crackled with flames fed by no wood he could see, sat a rocking chair he'd made with his own hands 30 years ago. Sarah's chair, crafted during their first winter of marriage, when her belly grew round with the promise of Jacob. He'd carved hearts into the headrest, painted it blue, because she said it reminded her of summer skies. The same chair he'd burned in rage the winter after she died, watched it turn to ash and smoke because he couldn't bear to see it empty. Yet here it sat, whole and real, rocking gently as if just vacated by invisible hands. On a table beside the chair lay a small wooden toy, a horse carved from pine, painted brown with white markings that matched the mare Jacob had loved but never owned. Elias had whittled it during long evenings when his son lay fever-sick, crafting dreams of better days, when the boy would be strong enough to ride real horses across real meadows. He'd buried the toy with Jacob, couldn't bear to keep it when its owner would never play again. But there it stood on 4 painted hooves, waiting for hands that would never touch it. Elias stumbled forward, legs weak as new grass, and sank into the rocking chair that shouldn't exist. It fit him perfectly, welcomed him like an embrace from someone who knew every ache in his bones, every scar on his soul. The wood was warm beneath his palms, smooth with the passage of years and the oil of loving hands. Sarah's hands, his hands, the hands of the man he'd been before the world, taught him that love was just another word for loss. He picked up the toy horse with trembling fingers, felt its familiar weight, the tiny imperfections where his knife had slipped or his attention wandered. On its belly, carved in letters so small he'd needed spectacles to see them clearly, were the initials J.B. Jacob Boone, the son who'd lived 18 years and died with his father's name on his side lips. The room around him seemed to breathe, walls expanding and contracting like lungs, like a heart that beat in time with his own. The light from the windows shifted and flowed, showing him glimpses of seasons that had passed, memories that lived on somewhere beyond the reach of time. He saw Jacob at 5, chasing butterflies through Sarah's garden. Jacob at 10, reading scripture aloud while Elias prepared Sunday sermons. Jacob at 15, tall and strong and full of dreams about the farm they'd never buy, the horses they'd never raise. Jacob at 18, burning with fever, asking why God let good people suffer while evil men prospered. Elias doubled over in the chair, toy horse clutched to his chest, and wept for the first time since they'd lowered his son into ground too hard for tears. The sobs came from somewhere deeper than grief, older than regret, a place where love and loss dwelt together like married strangers who'd forgotten how to speak. When the tears finally stopped, he found himself looking into the fire that burned without fuel, without smoke, without any of the laws that governed flame in the world beyond the door. In the dancing light, he saw faces: Sarah, young and laughing, flour in her hair from baking bread; Jacob, serious and thoughtful, reading his Bible with the intensity that marked everything he did; soldiers he'd pulled from battlefields, parishioners he'd comforted, people he'd touched in the years before. Sorrow made him too afraid to reach out his hand. The fire showed him who he'd been, what he'd lost, why he'd run to mountains that promised nothing but silence and the clean peace of isolation. But it also showed him something else, threads of connection that stretched from this impossible room to the world beyond, golden as sunlight, strong as hope, waiting for him to remember that some loves survive even death. He set the toy horse gently on the table and rose from the chair that knew his shape so well. The door behind him stood open, showing him the path back to his cabin, his solitude, his careful routine of survival without purpose. But the room around him pulsed with warmth and light, and the presence of those he'd loved, those he'd lost, those he'd left behind in his flight from grace. For the first time in 20 years, Elias Boone felt the stirring of something that might, with time and courage, grow into hope. 3 days passed before Elias found the courage to return to the oak tree. 3 days of restless pacing, of coffee gone cold while he stared out his cabin window toward the ridge, where impossible things waited behind a door that shouldn't exist. The glowing acorn sat on his mantel beside the tarnished war medal, 2 artifacts from different worlds that somehow belonged together in the strange museum his life had become. On the 4th morning, he woke with Sarah's name on his lips and the taste of her biscuits in his mouth, honey-sweet and warm as summer mornings. The dream had been so real he could smell the wood polish she'd used on their kitchen table, feel the soft brush of her fingers against his cheek as she kissed him goodbye for the last time. He packed his Bible. The leather binding felt foreign in his hands after years of neglect, pages stiff with disuse and disappointment. But something in the dream, the way Sarah had looked at him with eyes that held no accusation, only love, made him think that maybe, just maybe, the words inside might mean something again. Not the hollow comfort he'd tried to offer dying soldiers, but something deeper, truer, harder to break than human faith. The door in the oak opened at his touch, welcoming him back to the room that existed beyond reason. But this time, the space had changed, expanded, grown new corners and alcoves that held treasures from the life he'd abandoned. A bookshelf lined one wall, filled with volumes. He recognized his theological texts, Sarah's poetry collections, the adventure novels Jacob had loved. On a desk beneath a window that showed impossible gardens sat papers covered in his own handwriting, sermons he'd labored over during long evenings when faith came easier than breath. And there, open on a wooden lectern that had graced the pulpit of his last church, lay his Bible. Not the worn copy he carried in his pack, pages marked by his doubts and angry tears, but the one he'd owned before Jacob died. The leather binding gleamed rich and black, unstained by the blood that had splattered across it when he'd tried to read comfort to boys dying too young. The pages lay open to the Book of Lamentations, verses that spoke of hope in the midst of sorrow, of God's mercies that were new every morning. Elias approached the lectern with the reverence he'd once reserved for the altar, fingers trembling as they traced words he'd memorized but forgotten how to believe. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The room seemed to hold its breath as he read, waiting to see if the words would find purchase in soil too long left fallow. He turned the pages slowly, rediscovering passages that had once been as familiar as his own heartbeat. The Psalms of David, who knew what it meant to cry out to God from the depths of despair. The letters of Paul, written from prison cells to churches he'd helped birth. The promises of Christ, who wept at gravesides and understood the weight of human loss. "I remember preaching this," he whispered to the empty room, his voice rusty with disuse. His finger traced a verse in the Gospel of John. Jesus wept. 2 words that had saved his sanity during those first terrible months after Jacob died. Proof that even the Son of God understood grief so deep it had no bottom. The lectern began to glow with the same soft light as the acorn, and suddenly the room wasn't empty anymore. Faces appeared in the gentle radiance, men, women from his congregation in Silver Creek, people who'd come to him for baptisms and weddings and funerals, who'd trusted him to speak God's words over the most sacred moments of their lives. There was Martha Henley, ancient and bent, who'd asked him to pray over her dying husband. Tom Bradley, the young father who'd sought guidance when his farm failed and his children went hungry. Rebecca Foster, barely 16, who'd come to him pregnant and ashamed, needing someone to tell her that God's love was bigger than human judgment. The faces in the light looked at him with the same trust they'd shown 23 years ago, before he'd let doubt poison his faith, before he'd run from calling, because calling demanded more courage than he possessed. They didn't speak, but he heard their voices anyway, remembered the words he'd given them when his own words had still carried the weight of conviction. "God doesn't promise us easy," he'd told Tom Bradley, "but he promises he'll walk through the valley with us, and sometimes that's enough." "Your worth isn't measured by what you've done," he'd whispered to Rebecca Foster. "It's measured by whose image you bear, and that never changes, no matter what." "Love like your husband's doesn't end with death," he'd assured Martha Henley. "It just changes address." Words of comfort he'd believed when he spoke them, wisdom that had flowed through him like water through a clean vessel. When had he stopped being that vessel? When had he decided that God's promises applied to everyone except the man who spoke them? The light shifted, and new faces appeared, soldiers from the war, boys who died with his prayers on their lips and his hands on their fevered brows. They looked at him with gratitude instead of accusation, and he understood suddenly that he'd been carrying guilt that wasn't his to bear. He hadn't failed them by being unable to save them. He'd served them by being present in their final moments, by offering them hope, when hope was all they had left. The Bible's pages turned of their own accord, settling on a passage from 2 Corinthians that made his breath catch. "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort those who are in any trouble with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God." Understanding hit him like lightning striking stone. His own suffering hadn't disqualified him from ministry, it had prepared him for it. The grief he'd carried for 20 years wasn't a burden to be hidden, but a gift to be shared. Proof that he understood the cost of love, the weight of loss, the desperate hunger for grace that marked every human heart. He knelt before the lectern, not in worship but in surrender, letting go of the anger he'd nursed like a poisonous child. The room filled with warmth that had nothing to do with the impossible fire, everything to do with the mercy that was indeed new every morning, waiting for hearts brave enough to accept it. When he finally rose, the Bible remained open, glowing softly in the golden light. He touched its pages one more time, felt the words sink into his spirit like seeds finding fertile ground. For the first time in 20 years, Elias Boone remembered what it felt like to hope. The visits to the oak became a pilgrimage of sorts, a daily journey that marked time better than any calendar. Each morning after his simple breakfast, Elias would climb the ridge through mist and pine shadow, carrying whatever burden pressed heaviest on his heart. The door always opened for him now, welcoming him into a space that seemed to expand with his willingness to explore the chambers of memory he'd locked away. On the 7th day, he found a new room, It opened off the main chamber like a chapel annexed to a cathedral, smaller and more intimate than the space where Sarah's chair and Jacob's toy horse waited with patient love. This room glowed with softer light, touched with the rose gold of sunset, and smelled of lavender soap and fresh bread. At its center stood a dressing table he'd built for Sarah during their courtship, when his hands were steadier and his heart full of promises he'd believed he could keep. The mirror above the table reflected not his weathered face, but scenes from a life he'd almost forgotten. Sarah at 19, brushing her long auburn hair before their wedding. Sarah at 25, teaching Jacob his letters at the kitchen table. Sarah at 38, thin with the illness that would take her, but still beautiful, still brave, still looking at him with eyes that held no blame. On the table's polished surface lay objects that made his breath catch like smoke in his lungs. Sarah's silver hairbrush, its bristles still holding strands of auburn silk that caught the impossible light. Her wedding ring, simple gold, worn thin by work and weather, gleaming as if she'd just slipped it from her finger. A small vial of the lavender water she'd made each spring from flowers grown in her kitchen garden. But it was the letter that undid him. The paper was cream-colored, expensive stock they could barely afford, saved for special occasions that came too rarely. Sarah's handwriting flowed across the page in the careful script she'd learned from the nuns at St. Catherine's. Each letter formed with the precision of love, making itself known. The ink was still wet, as if she'd just set down her pen and stepped away for a moment. "My dearest Elias," it began, and his hands shook so hard he nearly dropped the impossible thing. The letter was dated 3 days after her funeral, written in a hand that should have been stilled by death, speaking words he'd never heard her say. Yet the voice in the lines was unmistakably hers, gentle but firm, wise in the way that only comes from loving someone completely and being loved in return. "I know, you blame yourself for what happened to me, but you must stop. The consumption was not your fault, any more than winter is the fault of the man who shivers in it. You loved me as well as any mortal man can love, and that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. I know you've gone to the mountains, thinking that isolation will somehow make the pain easier to bear. But pain isn't meant to be borne alone, my love. It's meant to be shared, carried between hearts that understand the weight of it. You were never meant to carry this burden by yourself. You think you failed me, failed Jacob, failed everyone who ever looked to you for hope. But Elias, dearest one, you gave me 23 years of happiness I never dreamed possible. You gave our son a father who taught him to read, to pray, to believe that goodness exists in a world that often hides its light. You gave your parishioners words of comfort when their own words failed them. The only failure would be if you stayed, lost in those mountains, if you let fear keep you from doing what God made you to do. You were born to be a bridge between the broken and the divine, to help people find grace in the midst of grief. Your own suffering hasn't disqualified you from that calling. It's prepared you for it in ways you can't yet understand. I'm not angry that you couldn't heal me. I'm grateful that you held me while I died, that you whispered prayers over my body even when your faith felt hollow as winter wind. Love like that doesn't end with death, Elias. It just changes address, moves to a place where your hands can't touch it but your heart still knows it's real. Come back to the world, my darling. Come back to the people who need what you have to give. The mountains have kept you safe, but safety was never supposed to be your destination. Purpose is waiting for you beyond that ridge, in towns full of people who carry burdens too heavy for one heart to hold. I love you. Jacob loves you. God loves you, especially when you can't feel it. That love is the one thing death can't touch, the one thing time can't wear away. Let it call you home to yourself, to the man you were meant to be. All my love, always and forever. Sarah. Elias read the letter 3 times before the words stopped blurring through his tears. Each reading revealed new layers, deeper truths that cut through the lies he'd been telling himself for 20 years. Sarah had never blamed him for her death, that guilt was a cage he'd built for himself, furnished with regret and locked tight with pride, disguised as grief. He pressed the letter to his chest, feeling the warmth of words that reached across the divide between living and dead, to offer the forgiveness he'd never dared ask for. The ring caught the light as he lifted it with trembling fingers, slipping the gold band onto his pinky finger, where it hung loose but solid. Proof that love finds ways to reach us even when we think we're beyond. Rescue. The room around him shimmered with presence he could feel, but not see, warm as summer mornings when Sarah would wake him with coffee and gentle kisses. He understood now that his exile in the mountains hadn't been about honoring her memory. It had been about punishing himself for being unable to save what was never his to save. Death was part of life. Sorrow the price of love, loss the shadow cast by every joy worth having. He tried to escape that truth by running to places where he couldn't be hurt again, but the mountains had taught him something else entirely, that isolation was just another form of death, slower, but no less final than the fever that took Sarah or the consumption that claimed Jacob. When he finally rose from the dressing table, Sarah's ring warm on his finger, Elias felt something shift in his chest, like ice breaking up in spring streams. The anger that had sustained him for 2 decades began to flow away, making room for something he'd almost forgotten how to feel. Peace. Not the empty peace of numbness, but the full, aching peace of acceptance, of surrender, of love that survives even when everything else falls away. The deeper chambers of the mystical space revealed themselves slowly, like trust earned through faithful visiting. On his 10th day of pilgrimage to the oak, Elias discovered a staircase spiraling downward from the main room, its steps carved from living wood that glowed with inner light. Each step he took carried him further from the world he knew and deeper into the heart of memory itself. The lower chamber felt different from the rooms above, heavier with history, thick with the weight of choices made and unmade. Shadows danced on walls that seemed carved from the very bones of the earth, and the air tasted of gunpowder and blood, of prayers whispered over dying boys and songs sung around campfires that would never burn again. At the chamber's center stood a simple wooden table, scarred by use and age, holding papers that seemed to glow with their own inner fire. As Elias approached, he recognized his own handwriting pages from a sermon he'd begun but never finished. Words about grace and second chances that he'd abandoned when Jacob's fever reached its peak and his own faith cracked like ice under pressure. The unfinished sermon was titled, "The God Who Finds Us in the Wilderness," and reading his younger self's words felt like listening to a stranger speak truths he'd forgotten he once believed. The pages spoke of divine love that pursued people into their darkest places, of mercy that waited in the spaces between heartbeats, of redemption that could bloom even in soil watered by tears. But it was what lay beneath the sermon that stopped his breath. Photographs, tintype images that shouldn't exist, showing moments from the war that lived only in his nightmares. But these pictures told a different story than the one he'd carried in his memory for 33 years. Instead of focusing on the blood and death that haunted his dreams, they showed the moments between hands reaching out to comfort, water offered to dying men, prayers spoken over bodies too young for graves. There he was at Antietam, kneeling beside a Confederate boy who couldn't have been more than 16, holding the enemy soldier's hand while life flickered out like a candle in the wind. The boy's face showed not fear but peace, the peace that came from knowing he wasn't dying alone. In another image, Elias saw himself reading scripture to a group of Union soldiers, their faces turned toward him like flowers toward sun, finding hope in words that had survived every battlefield since David faced Goliath. The photographs shifted and changed as he watched, showing him scenes he'd forgotten in his rush to catalog failures and count the costs of war. A young private whose leg he'd saved, who went home to marry his sweetheart and father 4 children. A chaplain from Georgia who'd sought him out during a brief ceasefire, thanking him for the kindness shown to dying Confederate boys. Letters from families whose sons had died with his prayers on their lips, grateful that someone had been there to usher their children into whatever waited beyond the veil. "You saved more than you lost," a voice said behind him, and Elias turned to see Jacob standing in the chamber's doorway, not the fevered boy who died in his arms, but the man he would have become. Tall and strong, with Sarah's eyes and Elias's stubborn jaw, wearing clothes that belonged to no earthly time or place. "Son," Elias whispered, the word catching in his throat like a prayer he'd forgotten how to say. "I've been waiting for you to remember," Jacob said, his voice carrying the warmth of summer evenings when they'd sat on the porch discussing theology and dreams. "You got lost in the guilt, Pa. Lost in the idea that love means being able to save everyone, heal everything, fix what's broken in the morrow world." Elias reached toward his son with trembling hands, but Jacob stepped back, not in rejection but in gentle correction. "I'm not here for you to touch, Pa. I'm here for you to understand. You think you failed because I died, because Ma died, because boys in the war died despite your prayers. But failure isn't measured by what you couldn't prevent. It's measured by whether you showed up, whether you loved, whether you offered hope even when your own hope felt thin as mountain air." The chamber around them filled with new images, not photographs, but living memories that played out like scenes on a stage. Jacob as a child, reading his favorite Bible stories, while Elias prepared sermons. Jacob as a young man, defending his father's faith to skeptical friends who thought religion was for the weak-minded. Jacob on his deathbed, not cursing God for his suffering, but thanking his father for teaching him that love was stronger than death. "I wasn't angry when I died," Jacob said, his voice gentle as evening wind through pine needles. "I was grateful. Grateful for 18 years of life, for parents who loved me, for faith that made death an adventure instead of an ending. You gave me that, Pa. You and Ma, you gave me everything that mattered." The unfinished sermon glowed brighter on the wooden table, pages stirring as if touched by invisible hands. Jacob gestured toward the abandoned words, his eyes bright with the same intelligence that had made him such a joy to teach. "Finish it," he said. "Finish what you started before fear made you forget who you were meant to be. The wilderness isn't where God abandons us, Pa. It's where he finds us. It's where he strips away everything false and shows us what's real. You've been wandering for 20 years, but the wandering was never punishment. It was preparation." The images around them shifted again, showing glimpses of a future. Elias couldn't yet imagine people seeking comfort, families torn by loss, reaching out for healing, communities where hope had died, waiting for someone to breathe life back into their dreams. In every scene, he saw himself not as the broken man he'd become, but as the bridge between sorrow and joy he'd been called to be. "There are people waiting for you beyond this ridge," Jacob continued. "People who need what you've learned in these mountains, what you've discovered in this place, between worlds. They need a man who understands that faith doesn't prevent suffering, it transforms it. That love doesn't promise easy, it promises presence. That grace isn't the absence of pain, but the promise that pain has purpose." The chamber began to fade around them, walls growing transparent as morning mist. Jacob smiled one last time. The expression so like Sarah's, it made Elias's chest ache with recognition. "Finish the sermon, Pa. Then finish the work you started all those years ago. The work of helping broken people find their way home to hope." When the vision ended, Elias stood alone in the chamber, holding pages that felt warm as living flesh. The unfinished sermon waited for completion, waited for him to remember that some callings survive even death, some purposes endure even exile, some loves grow stronger in the wilderness than they ever could in comfort. The storm came down from the high peaks like the wrath of a furious god, bringing with it wind that screamed through the pines and rain that fell in sheets thick as canvas. Elias woke to thunder that shook his cabin's foundations and lightning that turned the world white as bleached bones. Through his single window, he watched trees bend almost to breaking, their branches whipping like desperate hands clawing at the dark. His first thought was for the oak. The tree stood exposed on its ridge, ancient and massive, but still vulnerable to the kind of storm that could split granite and topple forests. If lightning found it, if the wind proved stronger than roots that had held for centuries, the big door would be lost, and with it, the only bridge he'd found between the world of the living and the realm where love survived death. He pulled on his heaviest coat and stepped into the maelstrom. The wind hit him like a physical blow, driving rain into his face hard enough to sting. Each step up the ridge became a battle against forces that seemed determined to hurl him back down the mountain. Pine needles and broken branches filled the air like arrows, and more than once he had to grab hold of a tree trunk to keep from being blown off the narrow path. By the time he reached the clearing, his lungs burned with cold and effort. The great oak swayed in the storm's fury, its massive trunk creaking with sounds like the groaning of a ship in heavy seas. Lightning split the sky overhead, illuminating the tree in stark relief, and Elias saw with horror that one of its main branches had cracked, hanging by splinters of wood that wouldn't hold much longer. He stumbled toward the door, fighting wind that seemed to have a malevolent intelligence, a desire to keep him from reaching the sanctuary within the tree's heart. The brass knob felt ice-cold beneath his palm, and for a terrifying moment it wouldn't turn, as if the storm had somehow sealed the entrance against him. Then it opened, and warmth rushed out to meet him. But something was wrong. Instead of the golden light that usually welcomed him, the interior glowed with silver radiance that hurt his eyes. The familiar rooms were still there. Sarah's chair, Jacob's toy, the table where his unfinished sermon waited, but they flickered like images seen through water, becoming transparent and solid by turns. "The bridge is failing," a voice said behind him, and he turned to see Jacob standing in the doorway, but not the grown man who'd spoken to him in the lower chamber. This Jacob was translucent, his form wavering like heat shimmer on summer stone. "The storm isn't just weather, Pa. It's time itself, trying to set things right." Elias reached for his son, but his hands passed through empty air. "What do you mean? What's happening? This place," Jacob gestured to the rooms around them, "it was never meant to last forever. It was built from love and need, held together by grief so deep it bent the laws of what's possible. But grief isn't meant to be permanent, Pa. It's meant to be transformed." The tree groaned overhead, and cracks of silver light appeared in the walls like fractures in glass. Through the gaps, Elias caught glimpses of the clearing outside, rain-lashed and wild. The impossible space that had become his refuge was coming apart at the seams. "You're healing," Jacob continued, his voice growing fainter as his form became more transparent. "You're remembering who you were meant to be. But as long as this place exists, part of you will always be trapped here, hiding from the world that needs what you have to give." More cracks appeared, and through them, Elias heard something that made his blood freeze, the sound of the great oak splitting, its ancient heartwood giving way to forces too great to resist. The door behind him slammed shut, and he realized with growing panic that he might be trapped as the mystical space collapsed around him. "Son, I'm not ready," he whispered. "I don't know how to live without this place, without being able to see you and your mother." Jacob's smile was sad but gentle, touched with understanding that seemed older than his years. "You were never supposed to see us forever, Pa. You were supposed to remember us, carry us with you, but not live in the past. We're not gone, we're just changed. We're in every sunrise you watch from that porch, Ma loved. Every person you help find their way back to hope. Every moment you choose love over fear." The chamber around them began to dissolve, the walls becoming mist, furniture fading like dreams upon waking. But as the mystical space fell apart, something else was happening. The cracks in reality weren't just destroying, they were revealing. Beyond the collapsing walls, Elias caught glimpses of something vast and beautiful, a realm of light where Sarah waited with her arms open, where Jacob stood tall and strong and whole. "This isn't goodbye," Jacob said as his form began to fade. This is hello. Hello to the man you're becoming, the life you're choosing to live. We'll be there in every act of kindness, every word of comfort, every moment you reach out to heal instead of hiding. The silver light grew brighter, and suddenly Elias understood. The mystical space hadn't been created by the tree. It had been created by his need, his love, his desperate hunger to hold on to what death had taken. The oak had simply provided a doorway, a thin place where the impossible became possible because love made it so. But now that love was setting him free, the real magic was never in this place, Jacob whispered as he faded completely. It was in you all along. It always has been. It always will be. The chamber collapsed with a sound like singing, like the voices of a choir celebrating something too beautiful for words. Elias felt himself falling, not down but up, not into darkness but into light, so brilliant it erased every shadow he'd carried for 20 years. When awareness returned, he found himself standing in the clearing, rain-soaked and gasping. The great oak still stood, but the door was gone, not destroyed, but transformed, absorbed back into the living wood, as if it had never been. Where the brass knob had hung, only bark remained, scarred but whole. In his hand, warm as a heartbeat, he held a piece of the tree's root, not broken off but given, shaped like a shepherd's staff, and glowing with the same gentle light as the acorn he'd first discovered. The root pulsed with life, with power, with the promise that some connections survive, even transformation. Thunder rolled across the sky one last time, and the storm began to move away toward the eastern peaks. As the wind died down and the rain gentled to a whisper, Elias understood that everything had changed. The mystical space was gone, but what it had taught him remained. The door between worlds had closed, but the bridge between broken and healed would endure as long as he had breath to speak hope into desperate places. He turned away from the oak and began his descent toward the cabin, toward the world, toward a future he could finally imagine. In his pocket, the glowing acorn had gone dark, its purpose fulfilled. In his hand, the living root pulsed with new promise, ready to help him build bridges wherever he found people who'd forgotten how to hope. The morning after the storm brought a silence so profound it felt like the world holding its breath. Elias stood on his porch, the living root staff in his hand, watching mist rise from the valleys like prayers ascending to heaven. The mountains looked different somehow, not changed in their physical form, but transformed in their meaning. Where once they'd been a prison of his own making, they now felt like a graduation ground, a place where he'd learned lessons that couldn't be taught in classrooms or sanctuaries. Inside the cabin, he began the work of packing 20 years of hermit's life into what a traveling man could carry. Each object he touched seemed to hold the weight of memory. The tin cup that had served 1,000 solitary meals, the worn boots that had walked countless miles of mountain trails, the razor he'd barely used because there'd been no one to look presentable for. Most of it would stay behind, offerings to the wilderness that had sheltered him through his long exile. But some things demanded to come along. His war medal went into the bottom of his pack, no longer a symbol of failure, but a reminder that courage could be found even in the darkest places. Sarah's wedding ring, warm on his pinky finger, would travel with him as proof that love survived every ending. The glowing acorn, now dark but still warm to the touch, nestled next to his old Bible, both artifacts of faith that had weathered storms and emerged transformed. The living root staff thrummed with energy in his hands, responding to his touch like a tuning fork struck against stone. When he gripped it firmly, he could feel something flowing through the wood, not magic exactly, but connection. A bridge between the world of flesh and blood and the realm where spirits dwelt, where wisdom waited for those brave enough to seek it. 3 days of preparation, 3 days of saying goodbye to the life he'd built in the shadow of self-imposed exile. He cleaned the cabin thoroughly, left it ready for whatever traveler might find shelter in its walls. The garden he'd tended for 20 seasons would return to wilderness, but the well he'd dug would serve any soul desperate enough to climb this high in search of water. Let it be a way station for other broken people seeking the kind of solitude that either destroyed you or remade you entirely. On the fourth morning, he shouldered his pack and began the long descent toward the world of men. The path down the mountain felt steeper than he remembered, his legs unsteady after years of walking familiar trails around his hermitage. But the staff in his hand provided balance, both physical and spiritual, its warm wood reassuring against his palm. Each step carried him further from the life he'd known and closer to whatever waited beyond the tree line. Halfway down the mountain, he encountered his first human beings in almost 2 years. A family struggled up the narrow trail, their faces etched with desperation and exhaustion. A man and woman in their 30s, leading an elderly horse that carried their meager possessions. Between them walked a girl, perhaps 8 years old, her face pale with the kind of fever that had claimed too many children in the frontier settlements. The man looked up as Elias approached, his hand moving instinctively to the pistol at his belt. 20 years of mountain living had left Elias looking more like a wild man than a preacher, beard gone, silver and shaggy, clothes patched and worn, eyes holding the distance that came from long solitude. But something in Elias's expression, some quality of presence rather than threat, made the man's hand fall away from his weapon. "Morning," the man said cautiously. "Didn't expect to meet anyone on this God-forsaken trail." "God hasn't forsaken anything," Elias replied, the words coming automatically, surprising him with their certainty. "Sometimes he just lets things get quiet enough that we can hear him properly." The woman looked up from where she knelt beside the fevered child, hope flickering in her eyes like candlelight in a draught. "Are you a doctor, mister? Our Sarah's been burning up for 3 days now, and we don't know what else to try." Elias approached slowly, hands visible and empty, except for the staff that seemed to glow faintly in the morning light. The child looked up at him with eyes too bright, too knowing, the same look Jacob had worn during his final days. But where Jacob's gaze had held resignation, this girl's held the fierce determination to keep fighting. "I'm not a doctor," Elias said gently, kneeling beside the child. "But I've sat with fever before, and I know something about praying when medicine runs short." The staff pulsed warm in his hand as he reached out to touch the girl's forehead. Her skin burned like a forge, but beneath the heat he sensed something else, a spirit too strong to be easily broken, a will that matched the mountain's own stubborn refusal to yield to storm or season. "What's your name, little one?" he asked softly. "Sarah," the child whispered, her voice barely audible above the mountain wind. "Like the lady in the Bible who had a baby when she was old. Mama says God gives us what we need when we need it, even if it doesn't look like what we expected." Elias felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than coincidence. Another Sarah, another child fighting for life, another chance to be present in the place where hope and despair met in mortal combat. But this time, he wouldn't run from the weight of it. "That's a beautiful name," he said, his hand still resting gently on her fevered brow. "And your mama's right about God's timing. Sometimes the help we need comes from unexpected places." He began to pray, not the formal liturgy of his preaching days, but something simpler, more honest. Words that came from the place where his own suffering had taught him the language of need, where 20 years of wilderness wandering had stripped away everything false and left only truth. As he prayed, the staff grew warmer in his hand, and he felt the presence of those he'd loved and lost standing beside him, not as ghosts or visions, but as the strength they'd left behind, the love that had shaped him into someone capable of offering hope to strangers on a mountain trail. The fever didn't break instantly. Miracles were rarely so dramatic as desperate people hoped. But something changed in the child's breathing, a settling that spoke of crisis past, of the body's own healing wisdom remembering its work. The color in her cheeks shifted from the harsh red of fire to the gentler pink of recovery, beginning its slow dance. "Thank you," the woman whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, whoever you are." "Elias Boone," he said, the name feeling strange on his tongue after years of answering to no one. "And I'm just a man who remembers that we're all meant to help each other carry the heavy loads." They talked for another hour as little Sarah rested in her mother's arms, her fever broken and sleep finally peaceful instead of tormented. The family was heading to California, chasing rumors of gold and the promise of new beginnings. They'd heard of a settlement called Hope's Rest, where a preacher was needed and a community waited to be born. "Funny thing," the man said as they prepared to continue their journey. "We heard that preacher might be you, Reverend Boone. Fellow in Silver Creek said you'd gone to the mountains but might come back someday when the world needed you." Elias felt the weight of calling settle on his shoulders like a familiar coat, heavy but no longer burdensome. The living root staff pulsed with warmth in his hand, and he understood that every step of his journey from the battlefield to the pulpit to the hermitage to this mountain trail had been preparing him for whatever came next. "Maybe that day has come," he said, looking down the mountain toward valleys where settlements struggled to survive, where people carried burdens too heavy for single hearts to hold. "Maybe it's time to find out what hope looks like when it stops hiding in the wilderness." As the family continued their climb and he resumed his descent, Elias felt the presence of something larger than himself, settling around him like morning mist. Not the desperate faith of his youth or the bitter doubt of his middle years, but something seasoned and sure, tested by fire and proven strong enough to bear the weight of other people's pain. The world waited below, broken and beautiful, desperate for anyone brave enough to stand in the gap between despair and healing. He'd spent 20 years learning how to survive alone. Now it was time to remember how to live among people who needed what the mountains had taught him, that love was stronger than death, that hope could grow in the hardest ground, that some bridges could only be built by those who'd learned to span the gap between loss and grace. The settlement of Hope's Rest sprawled along a creek bottom like a prayer written in timber and stone, its buildings rising from the valley floor with the stubborn determination of people who decided to make something permanent from the raw materials of wilderness and will. Smoke curled from a dozen chimneys, and the sound of hammers rang through the morning air as construction continued on what looked like a church frame, skeletal and unfinished against the autumn sky. Elias stood on the ridge overlooking the town, his pack heavy on his shoulders and the living root staff warm in his grip. After 5 days of walking down from his mountain hermitage, he felt like a ghost returning to a world that had moved on without him. The clothes he wore marked him as an outsider, patched and weathered, more suited to traplines than town squares. His beard hung wild and silver, and his eyes held the distance that came from years of talking only to wind and stone. But the settlement needed a preacher, and he needed to remember what it felt like to serve something larger than his own careful solitude. The first person to notice his approach was a boy chopping wood behind the general store, perhaps 12 years old, with the kind of serious expression that spoke of children forced to grow up too fast. The boy straightened as Elias passed, his gaze lingering on the staff that seemed to pulse with gentle light in the morning sun. "You, the preacher we've been expecting," the boy called out, his voice carrying the hope that frontier towns invested in anyone who might bring order to chaos, comfort to loss. "Might be," Elias replied, his own voice rusty from disuse. "Depends on what kind of preacher you're needing." The boy grinned and ran toward the center of town, shouting news of the stranger's arrival. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered, men and women in work clothes, children peeking out from behind their mothers' skirts. Faces marked by the particular blend of hope and wariness that characterized people who'd staked everything on starting over in hard country. Among them stood a man in his 50s, wearing the kind of store-bought suit that marked him as someone with authority in the community. He approached with the careful two positions, diplomacy of a town leader who'd learned that strangers could bring salvation or trouble in equal measure. "I'm Mayor Thompson," the man said, extending his hand. "We heard word from Silver Creek that Reverend Elias Boone might be coming down from the mountains. Would that be you?" The name felt strange on Elias's tongue, like putting on clothes he'd outgrown. "I'm Elias Boone," he said carefully. "Whether I'm still a reverend remains to be seen. I've been away from the calling for some time." "How long?" asked a woman from the crowd, her voice carrying the particular edge of someone who'd been disappointed before. "We've been praying for a preacher for 2 years now, lost our last one to consumption, and the one before that decided California gold was more appealing than frontier souls." Elias felt the weight of their expectations settling around him like snow, cold and suffocating. 20 years of isolation hadn't prepared him for this, the immediate need, the desperate hope, the assumption that his presence alone could solve problems that had festered in his absence from the world. 20 years, he said quietly, and watched hope flicker in their faces like candles in a draught. "I left the ministry when my son died, went to the mountains to work through some things that needed working through." The crowd shifted restlessly, disappointment rippling through their ranks like wind through wheat. But Mayor Thompson stepped closer, his eyes studying Elias with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to look past surfaces to find what lay beneath. "What brought you back?" Thompson asked. "After 20 years, what changed?" Elias lifted the living root staff, feeling its warmth pulse against his palm. In the gathered crowd, he saw faces marked by the same grief he'd carried, the same desperate hunger for meaning that had driven him into exile. A young mother holding a baby too thin, eyes shadowed with the fear that comes from burying children. An old man, leaning heavily on a walking stick, shoulders bent under burdens that couldn't be measured in pounds or years. A teenage girl with the hollow look of someone who'd lost faith in anything good coming her way. "I remembered," he said simply, "that some things are worth coming back for." As he spoke, something extraordinary happened. A small silver cross materialized in his free hand, appearing like morning dew but solid as stone, warm as hope, glowing with the same gentle light that had filled the mystical space within the oak. The crowd gasped collectively, and several people stepped backward in fear or wonder. But Elias felt only peace. The cross wasn't magic, it was recognition. A sign that the presence he'd encountered in the mountains hadn't abandoned him to face the world alone. The divine that had met him in his brokenness now walked with him into whatever came next. "I'm not the same man who left the ministry 20 years ago," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm not sure I can give you the kind of preaching you might be expecting, but I can promise you this. I know what it means to lose everything that matters and find out that love survives the losing. I know what it means to think God has abandoned you and discover he was just waiting for you to remember how to listen." The cross pulsed brighter in his hand, and Elias felt the calling that had been interrupted by grief and exile, settling back onto his shoulders like a garment made new. The silver cross blazed brighter in Elias's hand as he looked into the faces of the gathered crowd, seeing past their hope and weariness to the deeper wounds that marked every heart. The gift of the mystical space had left him changed in ways he was only beginning to understand, not just healed from his own grief, but granted sight that pierced the careful masks people wore to hide their pain. In the young mother's eyes, he saw the terror of a woman who'd already buried 2 children and lived in constant fear of losing the third. The old man's shoulders bent, not just under the weight of years, but under the burden of a son who died in a mining accident, leaving grandchildren he'd never meet. The teenage girl carried the shame of assault, the hollow belief that God had turned his face away from her when she needed protection most. Word spread through the settlement like wildfire, and within an hour the crowd had tripled. They gathered in the unfinished church, sitting on rough-hewn benches and standing along walls that still smelled of fresh pine. The skeletal rafters overhead framed patches of blue sky, and autumn wind whistled through gaps where walls would eventually rise to shut out the elements. "We don't have much to offer a preacher," Mayor Thompson said, his voice carrying an apology. "No parsonage built yet, no guarantee of steady pay. This is hard country, Reverend Boone. Good people, but life here has a way of testing faith until it breaks." Elias stood at the grue, front of the unfinished sanctuary, the silver cross warm in one hand and the living root staff planted firmly beside him. The staff had grown during his descent from the mountains, extending itself until it reached from floor to his shoulder, carved with symbols that seemed to write themselves in the living wood, crosses and trees intertwined, roots and branches, forming a pattern that spoke of connections between earth and heaven. "I'm not looking for easy," Elias said, his voice carrying clearly through the improvised church. "Easy doesn't teach us anything worth knowing. I'm looking for real. Real people with real problems who need real hope, not pretty words that dissolve the first time life hits hard." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and he saw faces turning toward each other with recognition. These were people who'd learned the difference between comfort and truth, between faith that wilted under pressure and belief that grew stronger in the breaking. 20 years ago, Elias continued, I thought faith meant having all the answers, being able to fix what was broken and heal what was hurting. When my son died despite my prayers, when my wife followed him despite my love, I figured God had either abandoned me or never existed at all. The teenage girl looked up sharply, something kindling in her hollow eyes. The young mother shifted the baby to her other arm, leaning forward to catch every word. Around the unfinished sanctuary, people who'd carried their wounds in silence began to feel the possibility that someone might understand their particular darkness. But pain isn't proof that God doesn't care, Elias said, the words coming from the deep well of wisdom the mountains had carved in his soul. Pain is proof that love matters enough to hurt when it's threatened. Grief isn't evidence of faith's failure, it's evidence of connection so deep that death can't sever it completely. As he spoke, the silver cross in his hand began to resonate with a sound like distant bells, and the living root staff pulsed with warmth that spread through the floorboards beneath his feet. But the real miracle wasn't in the artifacts themselves, it was in the way his words found their mark in hearts that had given up on being understood. I can't promise that believing in God will make your troubles disappear, he continued. What I can promise is that you don't have to carry them alone. There's a presence that walks with us through the valleys, sits with us in the dark hours, holds us together when everything else falls apart. I know because I spent 20 years trying to outrun that presence, and it never stopped pursuing me. In the back of the church, the old community bell, silent since the last preacher died, began to ring without anyone touching it. The sound rolled across the settlement like a voice calling people home, and more folks came running from fields and shops and cabins scattered along the creek. They filled the unfinished church and spilled out into the yard, drawn by something they couldn't name but recognized in their bones. I don't know what kind of preacher you were expecting, Elias said, as the bell continued its impossible tolling. But I'm the one. You got a man who's walked through the fire and lived to tell about it, who's learned that sometimes the only thing that saves us is admitting we're lost and letting love find us where we are. The crowd erupted in a sound that was part cheer, part sob, part prayer of thanksgiving. For the first time in 2 years, Hope's Rest felt like its name meant something. The silver cross blazed like a star in Elias's hand, and the bell rang on, calling scattered souls home to a place where broken could become blessed, where the wilderness of grief could bloom with unexpected grace. At that moment, surrounded by people who needed exactly what his exile had taught him to give, Elias Boone remembered what it felt like to be exactly where God intended him to be. 6 months later, the church at Hope's Rest stood complete, its walls risen around the rafters that had once framed only sky. Elias sat on the front steps in the early morning light, watching mist rise from the creek while the settlement stirred to life around him. The living memory box rested beside him on the wooden planks, a small cedar container that had appeared in his cabin one morning, glowing softly with the same light that had once filled the mystical space within the oak. The box held treasures more precious than gold, glimpses of the divine that he could share with those who needed to see that love survived every ending. When young Maria Santos had lost her husband in a logging accident, Elias had opened the box and let her see the golden threads that connected heart to heart across the veil. When old Henrik Jensen lay dying, afraid of what waited beyond his final breath, the box had shown him the warm light that welcomed all who'd lived with love as their compass. "Morning, Reverend," called Jenny Mitchell as she passed by, carrying fresh eggs from her henhouse. 6 months ago, Jenny had been the hollow-eyed teenager, carrying shame like stones in her pockets. Now she walked with purpose, her face bright with the confidence that came from understanding. Her worth wasn't measured by what had been done to her, but by whose image she bore. "Morning, Jenny," Elias replied, his voice warm with genuine affection. "How's the wedding planning coming along?" She blushed and grinned, engagement ring catching the morning light. "Tom's building us a cabin up near Miller's Creek. Says he wants our children to have mountains to climb when they're old enough to wonder what's beyond the next ridge." Children. The word no longer carried the sharp edge of loss, but held promise bright as sunrise. Jenny's healing had been one of the first miracles Elias had witnessed after settling in Hope's Rest, not the dramatic kind that made for exciting stories, but the slow, deep work of a soul, remembering how to trust, how to hope, how to believe in futures that held joy instead of just survival. The church doors opened behind him, and Mayor Thompson emerged, carrying a letter that bore the seal of the territorial government. "This came on yesterday's stage," he said, settling beside Elias on the steps. "Invitation from the folks in Clearwater Valley. They heard about what you've been doing here, want to know if you'd consider helping them start a church of their own." Elias took the letter, but didn't open it immediately. Through the morning mist, he could see the cemetery where they'd laid 3 souls to rest during his time in Hope's Rest: old Henrik, Maria's husband, and a baby who'd lived only 3 days, but had been loved completely in that brief span. Each funeral had been different from the hollow rituals he'd performed in his younger days. These services had carried the weight of real grief, but also the promise of real hope, the understanding that love was the one thing death couldn't touch. "There's another one came in too," Thompson continued, pulling a second envelope from his coat pocket. "From back east. Some church board in Philadelphia heard about the bell that rings itself and the preacher who came down from the mountains, carrying light in his hands. And what do you think I should do?" Elias asked, though he already knew the answer that was forming in his heart, like morning light cresting the peaks. Thompson was quiet for a long moment, watching the settlement wake to another day of building, working, hoping. "I think," he said finally, "that God didn't bring you down from those mountains to settle in one place and get comfortable. I think he's got bigger plans for what you learned up there." Elias opened the living memory box, and soft light spilled out, carrying with it the sense of pine and autumn and promises kept. Inside, he saw not just the past, but the future, other settlements, other people carrying burdens too heavy for single hearts to hold, other communities where the bell of hope needed someone to ring it back to life. The box showed him towns scattered across the territory and beyond, places where his story would plant seeds of possibility in ground that had given up on miracles. Not the flashy kind that made newspaper headlines, but the quiet transformations that happened when broken people remembered they were beloved, when communities discovered that healing was possible even after the deepest wounds. He closed the box gently and tucked it into his coat pocket. The letters could wait for proper answers, but his heart had already decided. Hope's Rest would always be home, the place where he'd remembered his calling and learned to trust the light that lived within him. But the world was full of wilderness places where people waited for someone to show them the way back to grace. "I'll need to train someone to take over here," he said, already planning the transition. Young Pastor Morrison from the Territorial Seminary had been visiting monthly, learning the kind of ministry that couldn't be taught in classrooms. And I'll need supplies for traveling a wagon maybe, something that can carry the essentials from town to town. The essentials? Elias smiled, thinking of the living root staff that now stood beside his pulpit, the silver cross that appeared whenever faith needed, visible reminder of invisible truth, the memory box that held glimpses of divine love for those whose eyes had forgotten how to see it. Hope, he said simply, just hope, in all the forms it takes when it's real enough to transform wilderness into holy ground. The sun cleared the eastern peaks, painting the settlement in shades of gold and promise. Somewhere beyond the horizon, other communities waited for the man who'd learned that the deepest magic wasn't in mystical doors or impossible spaces, but in the simple, revolutionary act of showing up with love, when the world had given up on anything better than mere survival. Elias Boone had spent 20 years learning how to live alone. Now he had the rest of his life to remember how to help others discover they were never as lost as they thought, never as abandoned as they feared, never beyond the reach of grace that could find them wherever the wilderness had taken them.